Welcome back to Tree Hugger Podcast, where we dig into the science, practice, and politics of ecological restoration and where we stay grounded in the relationships that make restoration possible in the first place. I'm Michael Yadrick, an ecological restoration practitioner based in Tacoma, Washington, on the traditional lands of the Puyallup people, and I want to start today by unveiling something new. The episode marks the launch of a semi-monthly tree hugger series I'm calling Grove and Grit. Grove because trees don't stand alone. They grow in relationship, in solidarity, in shared shade, and shared risk. And grit because the work is not abstract. It's dirt under the fingernails, contested ground, policy, fight, heartbreak, repair, and persistence. It's also a nod to Grit City, Tacoma's long history of labor, organizing, and showing up for each other when things are hard. Grove and Grit is where we'll check in on local to global restoration and the harder truths we don't always name. Environmental harm from war, authoritarianism, extraction, and climate disruption, alongside the people quietly rebuilding life anyway. And it feels especially right to launch this series during the week of Martin Luther King Jr.'s birthday. Dr. King was clear that justice is not divisible, that environmental harm, capitalistic exploitation, racism, and violence are all part of the same system. One of his lesser quoted but deeply grounding reminders was this: injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. That network of mutuality is ecological language as well. It's restoration language, and it's why Grove and Grit exists, because collective liberation and ecological care are inseparable. Before we go any further, two important local invitations. First, if you're in Tacoma, the Tree Foundation's Green Blocks Hilltop program is live right now, helping neighbors access trees, permits, and planting support in one of the city's historically disinvested neighborhoods. Tree requests are open, and the Hilltop planting event is coming up in March. You can find all these links to everything I'm about to say in the show notes, too. Secondly, I want to personally invite you to register for the January 28th Tacoma Tree Foundation webinar, where I'll be talking about plants as teachers, messengers, and climate partners. We'll be talking about habitat care, adaptation, and what plants are already telling us about the futures arriving faster than we had planned for. All right, let's start in Ireland, because this is one of those stories where restoration is both engineering and relationship. In Dublin Bay, in Dún Laoghaire Harbour, there's a project trying to bring back the European flat oyster, Ostrea edulis, and with it, an entire reef ecosystem that basically got erased by industrialization, dredging, overfishing, and pollution. The project is being driven by the Green Ocean Foundation, co-founded by David Lawlor, and their latest phase put 18,000 adult oysters into the harbor in 300 metal mesh baskets, not for eating, but for brood stock so they can spawn and rebuild reef structure over time. Now, here's what I love. The tactics are specific. The baskets are connected along a line in the water. Think, quote-unquote, reef infrastructure you can maintain. Volunteers flip the baskets by hand every few weeks to reduce fouling and keep water flowing. Basically, adaptive maintenance as the core of the restoration design. And scientists from Dublin City University's Water Institute are monitoring baseline conditions and reef impacts using sensors, plus chemical and biological assessment. This is the restoration story we need more of. Not nature's healing vibes, more like people are doing hard, careful work to rebuild habitat functions, which is filtration, shoreline stabilization, nursery habitat, nutrient cycling, and they're measuring what happens. So, my takeaway is oysters are the infrastructure you can love in the sea. Now let's zoom out to a bigger international signal. The United Nations is recognizing World Restoration Flagships, and importantly, naming Indigenous leadership as central, not decorative. In early December, the United Nations Environmental Program announced 3 new World Restoration Flagships in Australia, Canada, and South Africa, describing them as anchored in Indigenous peoples and local knowledge under the United Nations Decade on Ecosystem Restoration. One of the most restoration nerd-satisfying examples is Australia's revived shellfish reefs. The work was recognized for Indigenous and local leadership alongside the Nature Conservancies and Australia's Ministry for Environment and Water. The on-the-ground tactic here is the Reef Builder program. Between 2021 and 2023, it rebuilt shellfish reefs at 13 locations across 6 southern states, with the explicit aim of scaling to restore reefs across 30% of their original locations by 2030. So when big institutions call something a flagship, they're shaping what gets funded, what gets copied, and what becomes best practice. So if the recognition explicitly centers Indigenous and local leadership, that's a leverage point we should continue to push on everywhere, including our own projects. Okay, now for the harder segment. I always like Democracy's Now! War and Peace report, and I think restoration people need this because the ecological harm doesn't pause during armed conflict. It accelerates, and then it becomes someone else's cleanup job later on. The International Committee of the Red Cross put it bluntly recently, saying environmental damage from armed conflict contaminates water, soil, and air, erodes ecosystems, undermines livelihoods, and burdens public health long after fighting stops, citing Gaza, Ukraine, and Sudan as examples of different pathways of harm. In Gaza, the United Nations Environment Program reported catastrophic ecological damage. Since 2023, Gaza has lost 97% of tree crops, 95% of shrubland, and 82% of annual crops, with food production at scale no longer possible. The Environment Program also estimates 78% of buildings damaged or destroyed, which has generated 61 million tons of debris, with a significant fraction at risk of contamination from asbestos, heavy metals, or industrial waste if debris streams aren't separated early. In Ukraine, one of the restoration-relevant details is how accountability is being built with technology. The Environmental Law Institute describes Ukraine documenting environmental harms at scale, thousands of cases, while pointing to impacts on wetlands and forests and the broader push towards evidence systems that support legal claims and restoration planning. So, the restoration takeaway here isn't just grief, it's strategy. If you can't measure harm, you can't demand repair. If you can't document pollution pathways into water, soil, and debris, then reconstruction becomes another extraction cycle. And if your politics doesn't include anti-war and anti-authoritarian work, you're signing up to restore the aftermath forever. Which leads us into the fascism and ecological violence thread. Restoration is not only planting, it's insisting on conditions where life can continue. So next, a quick climate pulse from December and January. The World Meteorological Organization confirmed that 2025 was one of the warmest years on record, and multiple reports highlighted that the 3-year average from 2023 to 25 has now crossed the 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. An alarming signal for the new normal restoration is being asked to operate inside. So yes, plantings matter, reefs matter, urban canopy matters, but the climate baseline is shifting under our feet, meaning restoration has to be bolder, more adaptive, and more politically defended than the old playbooks assumed. 2 good reads to close, both directly connected on how we talk about quote-unquote native, quote-unquote invasive, and what restoration is for. And the reason why I put this one in the report today is because it's from one of my favorite authors and researchers and interrogators, Emma Marris, along with some other co-authors. A forthcoming scholarly piece titled Many Pasts, Many Futures, Navigating the Complexities of Species Reshuffling to Help Prevent Extinctions. It explicitly frames our era as ongoing species reshuffling, asks conservationists to interrogate values and measurability around nativeness, and argues for a pluralistic, future-facing ethos that's transparent about the values beneath our love for the more-than-human world. This is exactly the kind of article that can help restoration folks stop pretending there's one pure baseline and start having honest conversations about responsibility, harm, and care. Next, a forthcoming AK anarchist press book from Olympia writer Clare Follmann called Scapegoat, What the Invasive Species Stories Gets Wrong. The AK press description is basically that the quote-unquote invasive species war story can become cover for business and political interests, and we should be looking harder at the real system driving ecological crisis. It's a timely provocation, especially if you're trying to agitate around fascism ending ecological violence before ecological restoration is necessary. So that was quick and dirty, hopefully. I'd like to do this a little more often because I think it's a little more accessible than the deeper dive, hour-long conversations I normally do. And it's really sunny today, so I need to get outside. As we close out this first Grove and Grit episode, I want to thank you genuinely for listening, for staying curious, and for caring about the long arc of repair. If there's one thing I hope you take from today, it's this. Restoration does not begin after harm ends. It begins while harm is still happening. Whether you're planting a tree on your block, restoring an oyster reef, teaching a class, organizing against displacement, or simply paying attention, you are part of the grove. And grit is what keeps us rooted when the ground is contested. If this episode resonated, subscribe, leave a review, and come back for the next Grove and Grit check-in, where we'll keep tracking what's being broken, what's being healed, and who's doing the work. And don't forget, all these links are in the show notes. You can register for the January 28th webinar, get involved in Green Block's Hilltop, and take a moment on Monday or throughout the week, or any day really, to honor Dr. King's vision of collective liberation, not as a metaphor, but as a practice. Stay rooted, stay gritty. See you in the woods.